Story 1, Amnesia, The Dark Descent. The water level was one of the most intense experiences I have had in gaming. The final few moments of leaving it had my heart racing in a let me put this down for now kind of way. Story 2, Dead Space was the first game I had to stop playing. Resident Evil 4 scared me, but I persevered through it. Story 3, Subnautica. Underwater levels and games give me fear. Story 4, for me it was Skyrim. When you go into the first Draugr tomb, I was so scared my brother had to sit beside me. Halfway through the cave, he left to play Skyrim on his PC, and I just turned off the game and waited until he had time to sit beside me again. Rest in peace, brother. Story 5, Ocarina of Time. When I first went inside the Deku Tree, then again in the Forest Temple, and again at the bottom of the well, and for the last time when I saw the gap before the first room in the Shadow Temple. As a 9-year-old kid, the game was full of horror and suspense in places I did not expect. I screamed when I saw the zombie freeze Link in the cemetery, but that was only for about 2 seconds before I understood what was going on. Story 6, The Suffering. I had the house to myself. It was the middle of the night, and I thought, I'll treat myself to the surround sound. I heard blades scraping along the walls, growling in the distance. Then I walked around the corner, and a big creature jumped out of the ground. I said, no thanks, and decided to watch episodes of Scrubs instead. Story 7, Vampire, The Masquerade Bloodlines. There is a part where you explore a haunted building. It has some jump scares, poltergeist activity, ghostly figures, and other spooky elements. It is all quite cheesy, so it was not too bad even for my 13-year-old brain. Then I entered an elevator or another enclosed space. I do not remember exactly. 1 second later, there was an awful noise, and I was completely shocked with no idea why. For some reason, it affected me deeply. It was days before I played the game again, and nothing happened in that elevator that time or in any future playthrough. Story 8, Resident Evil 4. I started the game. It was cool, a bit scary, but okay. A friend of mine told me about the bladed blind zombie that you have to divert by ringing bells. His story was so scary I just left the game, too scared to meet that zombie. I recently played the reworked version and thought, oh, that is this guy. I should not have stopped for this as a kid. Story 9, Parasite Eve, when the rat peeled its skin off and transformed. Then, years later, Fatal Frame. Story 10, Dead Island. As a kid, I couldn't play it without another online player. I beat it solo as an adult. I was still a bit terrified though. Story 11, System Shock 2. I think I was only about 13 or so. I have since played all the other games people listed, and they did not bother me. That game scared me as a child. Story 12, Ocarina of Time Queen Goma boss fight in the Deku Tree. I was 5 years old, but having a massive monster drop from the ceiling was not good for me as a child. Nightmares followed for days. I finally got over it, but then they introduced the dead hand. I really disliked that part of the game. Despite that, it became and still is my favorite game somehow. Story 13, Fatal Frame scared me a lot, and I played it when I was about 20 years old. Story 14, for me, the first game I played when I was about 11 or 12 years old was Resident Evil Outbreak in the area where the Leech Man appears. I felt incredibly alone, being stalked by a monster that would show up without warning. It was quite formidable, so I felt like I stood no chance. I turned it off and was scared it would come after me in real life. That game really scared me, and nowadays I love horror games. Story 15, Alien Isolation. I remember not long after it was released at a convention, there was a virtual reality modification set up for it. You could hear blood-curdling screams across the hall. Crawling through a pipe and suddenly being dragged out, having an alien tail pierce through your chest in first person, is enough to experience once or twice for me and never again. Story 16, Condemned, Criminal Origins. I found that game to be very unsettling for some reason when I was younger. Story 17, Half-Life 2's Raven Home was pretty scary. In the early days of Steam, there was a Half-Life 2 demo that included about 1/3 of the Raven Home level. I did not have the courage to even enter the level. Story 18, when The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time came out, I got scared in the Shadow Temple and turned it off. I was very young, though. Story 19. Minecraft in virtual reality. I was not prepared. Loaded in and found a creeper. It was taller than I was. I looked up at the creature before I ran for my life. I fell off a cliff, which was even more terrifying, into a hole with zombies. Story 20. I do not know, but the minigame Hotel 626 gave me nightmares when I was 10 years old. Story 21. Subnautica, and I do not think I will ever play it again. I legitimately got nightmares from it. Story 22. Diablo 1 back in 1997. I was 7 years old. I was already disturbed by the wounded man at the front of the cathedral, but was terrified once I heard the scream, "Ah! Fresh meat!" Of course, I died and the screen turned red to the game over screen. That frightened me so much I had to turn the computer off. Story 23. The closest I can think of is the Dead Space series. I did not really have to turn it off, but found myself needing to psych myself up to play it. Story 24. The original Aliens vs. Predator. Playing in the dark, leaning back on a dining room chair, hearing that motion sensor beeping while stalking around as a colonial marine trying to sneak up on a predator. Out of nowhere, a xenomorph dropped from the ceiling and ended my character so quickly that I fell backward off my chair. I decided it was a good time to quit and go to bed. Story 25. Last Half of Darkness, 1989, though I would have played it around 1994 as a bargain bin purchase, if I remember correctly. 99% of the game is about as scary as a bath towel. However, there is one specific jump scare that is completely unexpected and very startling if you are not aware it will happen. Anyway, I was playing it, reached that part, and decided I no longer needed to play Last Half of Darkness. I have not touched it in about 30 years and have no desire to now. Story 26. Minecraft when cave noises were first added. They were included in a secret Friday update, so no changelog was provided. Story 27. Surprised I have not seen anyone mention Subnautica. I just could not handle the jump scares. Story 28. When I was a young child, nothing scared me more than the sound of a nearby cyberdemon in Doom. Story 29. I don't really play scary video games, so my choice is a very recent game. Alan Wake 2 scared me so much that I could only play for short periods of time and then took multiple weeks off before returning. Story 30. I have never had a game make me tap out, but playing the first Dead Space for the first time ever, at night with the lights off, gave me a full anxiety attack. Story 31. I do not game, but I love watching my partner play. He was playing The Evil Within, and we were both so stressed and shaky. I ended up finding a walkthrough and gave him a heads up right before an attack. We made a pretty good team. Story 32. Mine is pretty funny, thinking about it now. There was a visual novel set in an underworld office with a great art style. I am not a fan of horror or even slightly scary games. I thought, well, it can't be that bad, right? After the first jump scare, I nearly fell off the chair, had to make myself breathe normally, and deleted the game as soon as I could reach my phone without feeling panic. Story 33. When the old Xbox 360 started lagging, I thought my world was haunted by Herobrine. Story 34. Resident Evil 1 was released when I was 7 years old. I still remember the first zombie that wakes up in the beginning. I was very afraid. However, I got used to it, and by the time Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released, I was old enough to understand and play games well. It became one of my favorite games as a child. Story 35. The fears to fathom games are quite terrifying. My boyfriend and I decided to play them together. Story 36. I was about 8 or 9 years old when the part in Tomba 2, where the last evil pig freezes time and the droning music plays, gave me chills. Story 37. Strange as it sounds, Star Wars droid works. That assassin droid would scare the hell out of you. Story 38. I stopped halfway through Halo Combat Evolved at that level when I was 10 and went straight to Halo 2. Story 39. This one is weird, but out in the wild, I hit something and bounced into Giants Deep for the first time. Something about that was just no-go territory for me. Story 40. A little different but Outer Wilds. Descending into the unknown or floating into the void was too much. Story 41. Old schooler here. Back then, playing Turokey at 3:40 a.m., dark, and hearing the loud thumping footsteps of a Tyrannosaurus Rex charging at me. I didn't turn it off but was shocked. I played for another 3 hours, then got ready for work. Story 42. Old game Shadowgate with the poor quality speaker in the computer that would suddenly produce sounds. Story 43. My first time playing Dead Space was in a dark room after being awake for 32 hours. I started thinking that the sound of the necromorphs skittering in the dark around me was real. Story 44. When I was 6, my parents got me Pets Cats 2, which is a little adventure game where you run around as a cat. I couldn't complete one of the little islands because the vultures would swoop down and attack you, and it scared me. I had my dad complete it for me. Story 45. Resident Evil and Silent Hill on PlayStation 1. The only thing that could clear my mind was riding a chocobo around the green grass and blue sky world of Final Fantasy VII. Story 46. Why does the title read like a clickbait YouTube video? Gamers, which game made you scared at 3 a.m.? Story 47. The original fear. I had gotten a gaming laptop for the first time. I was playing it in my friend's basement at a sleepover. It was around 4 a.m. I was the only one awake. The lights were off, and it was stormy and rainy outside. I remember the hospital level with Alma stalking me around every corner. I was extremely low on health, already freaking out, hands shaking, heavy breathing. As I was walking down a hallway in the hospital, I came to a corner where I heard a baby crying. I literally had uncontrollable shakes. I rounded the corner, looked at the maternity ward window, the lights went out, and a monster nurse slammed against the window, blood splashing everywhere. I freaked out. I jumped out of my seat, heart pounding, the laptop went flying, cables were pulled everywhere, and the mouse got thrown at the TV. I ran out of there so fast. I hit the power button, ran upstairs, and went to bed next to a night light. That night, I learned the true meaning behind the game fear. Forget everything and run. One of the best games I have ever played. Story 48. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I was playing Mighty Final Fight on the Nintendo Entertainment System. I would always stop at the third boss and turn the game off because one of his attacks involved inappropriate behavior toward the player character. Story 49. That burrowing lobster bit in Warframe could not technically turn the game off but went away from keyboard and would just move the stick around every once in a while to keep it from timing out. Story 50. Escape from Bug Island on the Nintendo Wii. The enemy design was terrifying as a child, especially that strange dog with the human face. Story 51. I have never played any game like that. I had some games that made me pause and look behind me. Story 52. Resident Evil. Also adding Thief, the Dark Project, any level after level 1. Story 53. Visage. I was warned. The very first few seconds of the intro scene, I was navigating the haunted house, and I swear my blood pressure was rising as the panic and danger signs started to glow. A teddy bear moved position when I looked back, and I almost punched my laptop screen. It is incredibly good at being frightening. It is also subtle that it gets into your head, and then it is not so subtle. I screamed when I was in the kitchen. If you have played it, you will know. I never made it as far as the basement or lower floor. Now, Story 54. The first Resident Evil. However, the scariest game I have ever played is Alien Isolation. In virtual reality, that game is intense. I barely beat Resident Evil 7, also in virtual reality, and decided not to continue. Story 55. Escape from Horrorland. Once I entered the sewer levels, the atmosphere and ambience made me freeze in my tracks. Story 56. Amnesia. Stress fried my nerves, and I could only play for about 15 minutes before needing a break. It is really the only game that affects me like that. Story 57. The first game I remember scaring me just by watching was Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1. I went to spend the weekend at my cousin's, and I still remember watching him play. That was the first time I learned about zombies. It scared me so much that I had nightmares for a long time afterward. The first game that made me quit immediately was Alien. Isolation. That game still unsettles me even today. I love the game itself, but I can never finish it because it freaks me out to the core. Story 58. Outlast. The first jump scare occurs in the library when you open the door, and a man jumps down hanging from the ceiling. Story 59. The Forest. It is not that scary now that I know everything about the game, but the first time I was dragged to the cave and surprised by a mutant while trying to find a way out, I literally had to start a new save because I was very frightened. Even years after stopping playing the game, I still have nightmares of being chased through a forest by hordes of cannibals and mutants. Story 60. I think I actually got scared by Thief 2 when I was a kid, definitely younger than 11. There was nothing scary about it, really. Just little me getting way too worked up about creeping through the darkness and being scared of getting caught. Story 61. Minecraft. Not because it is scary, but because I was afraid of losing my progress. Story 62. Silent Hill. Never played that game at night. Always in the morning with the door open. Story 63. When I was a kid, playing Dying Light when it turned night was not scary at all. Really? But as a kid, it gave me nightmares. Story 64. Outlast. Watching Let's Plays was easy, but playing? Absolutely not. Story 65. I am somewhat old and have been gaming since before the Nintendo Entertainment System, but nothing ever frightened me until Outlast. That is just twisted. Story 66. The Evil Within made it through the intro. I had a great story I wanted to finish. I searched YouTube to see if anyone was live streaming it and watched my first gaming stream. Thanks, Markiplier. Story 67. Friday the 13th for the Nintendo Entertainment System when I was a kid. You would be just walking down a path and suddenly the Jason meter would start going off, but you would never know where he was going to come from and the music would start. I lost my mind a few times. After that, Resident Evil 2. Story 68. I almost forgot to mention that scary ghost in the mirror in Hitman. Story 69. I was a child at the time, but the death claws in Fallout New Vegas scared me greatly. Story 70. When I was a young boy, I was terrified of Petey Piranha in Super Mario Sunshine. Story 71. Stop the Old One. I knew exactly what I was up against, and yet I was never more terrified. Story 72. Not a horror game, but that Xena Warrior Princess game on PlayStation 1. So what happened was the game had a few scratches, and when it loaded, it crashed on a black screen. There was a man screaming like he was falling into a death pit, followed by a thud. The scream was cartoony yet scary at the same time. I quickly pressed the off button. I was 7 at the time, and my heart was racing. I did not know what to do, but to make sure I was not just hearing things, I decided to try it one more time after cleaning the disc. The game went to a black screen, and the scream happened again. I never turned it back on. I snapped the disc and threw it in the bin. To this day, it lives rent-free in my head. If anyone else had this game and experienced the same thing, I want to know if it happened to them too or if it was just a one-off on my CD. Story 73. The game is not that scary compared to others, but the hotel basement in The Last of Us made me put my controller down and go to bed once it was over. Story 74. For me, it was 13. The stealth missions were so intense, and the associated deaths and failures were too much for me to tolerate as an early teenager. I remember walking away from the game for weeks at a time before I could play again. Story 75. I have no idea what my first horror game was. I was 7 or 8. Story 76. Not scary by design, but one time I was playing GoldenEye multiplayer by myself, testing out different guns when the second player character began moving on its own. I was the only person in the house, the second controller was next to me, and this was long before wireless controllers existed. Freaked me out, so I turned off the game. Story 77. I played Doom 3 in the middle of the night on a laptop with the only light coming from my screen. There is a spot where the screen turns blood red and you hear, "They took my baby." I shut it off and started Grand Theft Auto 3 for an hour just to be able to sleep that night. Story 78. Resident Evil 2 did not make it past the opening cinematic. Years later, my girlfriend bought me Resident Evil for virtual reality, but I never started it. Story 79. I played Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Project Zero. No problem. I'm ashamed to admit that I can't play Minecraft. Yes, Minecraft. I just can't go down into the caves. It's dark, I run out of torches, and I can hear spiders and creepers all around. No, edit. And that black thing you cannot look in the eyes or it comes and kills you. Story 80. Resident Evil 1 on the PlayStation 1. It was the door-opening cutscene and loading screen. It would fill you with fear of what was on the other side. And yes, that shows how old I am. Story 81. Haha. Skyrim. I was 7, I think, when I first played it. I could not get past Bleak Falls Barrow. It just freaked me out. Story 82. Quake. Getting lightning damage from the first shambler I encountered caused me to invent both bunny hopping and backtracking at once. Story 83. Eternal Darkness. I just could not. I think it was my first encounter with something Lovecraftian. I had to get my friend to play it so I could watch. Story 84. Doom 3 has a setting and atmosphere so chilling that I couldn't play it at the time. Interestingly, I watched the movie Doom with Dwayne Johnson and Carl Urban, and after that, I was able to play the game without any issues. I felt like a badass. Story 85. Dying Light. The first time it got dark and zombies were chasing me, I hadn't even saved. I turned it off and never played it again. Story 86. Eternal Darkness. Sanity's Requiem. When you suddenly see your own corpse in the bath full of blood. A massively underrated Nintendo GameCube game. Story 87. Subnautica had to take a few breaks during my first playthrough. Story 88. A bit niche but Lord of the Rings, The Third Age. I was 9 and understood the films enough to know that none of these are main characters, but the main characters are there. The Fellowship couldn't beat the Watcher, and sneaking through Moria with the threat that the Balrog could show up at any second made me very nervous. I didn't understand it was a scripted boss fight and thought it could appear at any time. I turned it off and took a couple of years before I went back to it. Story 89. An old Macintosh game by Bungie before Halo called Pathways into Darkness was released in the late 1990s. The first time I encountered the ghost apparition, I was very frightened. Story 90. Alien Trilogy. A facehugger is creeping up my screen. Story 91. Resident Evil was scary to 10-year-old me, especially when you run into the dogs for the first time and cannot aim well. Story 92. I was only about 8 years old, but I got to that part in Sonic 2 and did not play for weeks. Story 93. Goosebumps Escape from Horrorland definitely shook me when I was a kid. That particular chase scene with the mummy, I begged my older sister to finish it for me. Story 94. I think I might be wrong, but I believe it was Devil May Cry 1, perhaps. Story 95. Thief. Deadly Shadows with the Asylum map. I completed it years ago. Story 96. Silent Hill. I started playing it at night when it first came out. I saw what looked like a naked demon child attack me in an alley and put that on hold until the morning. Story 97. Haunted House on Atari. Hear me out, it was the first jump scare game I ever played. I was 6 years old when I got it, and it was very different from almost all the other Atari games at that time. Honorable mention after Haunted House is the first Resident Evil. That was a whole new level when it came out. Story 98. Dread Halls on Virtual Reality. I remember watching Markiplier play it because it was the only game so scary it made him cry. I thought, I can do that. I turned the first corner and saw nothing but inky black darkness. There was no way I was walking down that hallway, so I turned it off. Story 99. Resident Evil. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I was not supposed to be playing with my sister's PlayStation, especially that game. The first zombie you encounter, the one that is eating someone and slowly turns around to look at the camera for a close-up, scared me. I hit the power button so fast and got out of there. Story 100. Dino Crisis. That dinosaur bursting through the window scared me a lot. The dogs in Resident Evil scared me too, and I was just watching my friend play. The Shadow Temple in The Legend of Zelda. Ocarina of Time scared me so much I made my cousin complete the temple for me. Story 101. It was just a demonstration, but my goodness, even 10 years later, that thing still scares me. Story 102. Scary maze game. I had to turn my computer off and unplug my headphones. Story 103. I am sensitive when it comes to horror and anything scary, so I typically avoid it. However, Twilight Princess was pretty scary to me. I was also about 12 years old. I did not expect it to be that way. I do not think I could play it again. It was such a beautiful game nonetheless. Story 104. I grew up on Resident Evil and other survival horror games, and I got Silent Hill to play alone at night. This was probably in 2002. I stopped playing at the Otherworld school because I was very scared. I only finished it years later as an adult on the PlayStation Portable. Story 105. There was a game on the early Nintendo 64 called Nightmare Creatures that I still think about today. Story 106. My first personal computer horror game was Shade: Wrath of Angels. I was a kid, and it sent chills down my spine. Story 107. I was up late at night, long past my usual bedtime. I was slowly losing my ability to see clearly and think straight. I was playing Warcraft 2, commanding my Death Knights and managing them carefully. I did not know about their annoyed voice lines, and my Death Knight said, "When I'm finished with my work, I'm coming back for you." That was my cue to go to bed, and I may or may not have barricaded the door to my room. Story 108. Half-Life 2, specifically. We do not go to Ravenholm. It was 1 a.m. when I got to that mission. I avoided it until the next day. Story 109. Dead Space 1. I was about 13 when I played through it. I could only play for 15-minute intervals before I would start shivering from nerves and adrenaline. For my very first run, I played on the hardest difficulty using only a pistol because I was an achievement hunter. If I was going to complete multiple playthroughs, I wanted to get that over with early. Story 110. Batman Arkham Asylum scare had me run out of the room screaming. Story 111. The original Fatal Frame. I was used to the Resident Evil and Silent Hill kind of horror games where I could just go into another room to depawn the enemies. In Fatal Frame, the areas are large and the ghosts can follow you indefinitely. If I remember correctly, you could outrun them and they would stop chasing you, but it was still a terrifying experience for me. Story 112. I remember playing Doom 3 Alpha in 2002, a time when it was graphically far ahead of anything released. I had recently acquired a set of 7.1 surround speakers, as was the style at the time, and played it in the dark. Hearing tiny noises behind me from all corners of the room, with these graphics like nothing I had seen before, put me completely on edge. Story 113. There is a game for PlayStation called D. I was a kid, maybe about 13 or a little younger. I couldn't play alone, but a few friends and I during a sleepover beat the game. Well, technically we lost because we made the wrong decision at the end. We stayed up all night. Story 114. Sonic the Hedgehog 3. There is a level inside a pyramid where you have to keep finding light switches to keep the ghosts away. The longer the lights are off, the more well-formed the ghosts become until they are fully formed and keep attacking you. The first time that happened, I turned the game off and did not play for a week. Story 115. That Slender Man game had me sweating bullets. Once I died, I turned around, and my friends set up a mannequin right outside the door to scare me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I attacked that mannequin. I also broke its glass base and cut my foot. It was a good time. Story 116. 40 Winks. I was pretty young when I started playing it, and it just really freaked me out. Story 117. Resident Evil 3 on PlayStation 1. I was about 8 years old and bought the game against my parents' will. I never got past the initial scene where Jill comes out of the fire and the zombies swarm her because I did not know how to shoot. Story 118. The original Resident Evil on the PlayStation. Those damn dogs in the hallway. Story 119. When I started playing Dying Light, I never went out at night because I was afraid of the volatiles. Story 120. I had to think about it, but both Amnesia and that Slenderman game where you collect notes made me stop and come back at a later time. Story 121. Not scary, but the Evil Within and the Outlast games give me intense anxiety for some reason. Story 122. I'm a game tester and have tested a multitude of games. I can't remember the title, but I tested a virtual reality game that resembled Resident Evil. although I am certain it was not Resident Evil. Creatures kept jump scaring and attacking me. It was setting up another station. Apparently, I made one of the creatures jump when I screamed in an open office. He went to get my test lead in another room because I was screaming and crying due to a mild panic attack. I refused to test that day. They replaced me with another tester on a comedic game to help improve my mood. Since then, I refuse to test any kind of horror games. I will cry and hide under my desk. Story 123, Doom. When first released in the early 1990s, most people did not have access to any type of network. I worked in a PC clone store and had access to many different network options, including Ethernet, Token Ring, and Novell. Doom had multiplayer settings built in where you could configure 3 computers via networking for a virtual reality effect. You had your primary PC controlling the main CRT monitor, with a PC on the left and right for your peripheral vision. They were all coordinated and controlled by the master PC, so when you moved, turned, pivoted, or slid left and right, the screens were in sync. It was an incredible immersive effect, especially if you played in a dark room to minimize distractions. Story 124, The Suffering on the PlayStation 2. I played it when I was young, and I remember it being pretty terrifying back then, to the point where I would restart it to stop myself from having to progress further. Story 125, Dark Souls 2. Well, only one region. I believe it was Brightstone Cove. A spider jumped on me from above, and I quit the game after that for a few weeks. Story 126. I would play The Last of Us on PlayStation 4 late at night in the dark, and several times I had to stop because I was just too on edge. Story 127. Spider-Man for PlayStation 1, specifically the Rhino boss fight. I was very young, and I just remember being immediately terrified and shutting the console off. Story 128. Parasite Eve for me. I was 6 or so, and that early scene with the rat made me cry whenever someone mentioned the game. Story 129. Call of Duty. Black Ops 2 Zombies was the only game that ever scared me when I was 7 years old. From that point on, no matter how scary a game is, I make sure to play it and complete it without being afraid of anything that might appear. Oh yes, also Five Nights at Freddy's. Help wanted. Seeing an 8-foot bunny walk past me terrified me. Story 130. The first Resident Evil. The zombie dogs in the corridor specifically. Story 131. Killer 7. The heavenly smiles were too much for me. I still finished the game many years later, though. Story 132. Alien. Isolation is something I watched on YouTube, so I do not know if it counts. However, Project Zomboid scared me a lot when I first played it. Story 133. The first first-person shooter Alien game back in the day. Logged in to the crashed all-terrain vehicle and the whoop-whoop of the movement scanner. No way. Exit. Story 134. Resident Evil 2. I played it first when I was 10 and spent about a week sleeping in my parents' room. Story 135. Siren. Blood Curse. And of course Silent Hill Downpour. I still love them. Story 136. Alien 3 for Super Nintendo Entertainment System. That intro made me very uncomfortable every time. I always skip it instantly. Story 137. I used to be very scared of my Nancy Drew computer game. I was also a child. Story 138. Thief was not scary as much as it was creepy, but getting caught was always a jump scare, I thought. Resident Evil, the first one, was nothing if not creepy and scary. Finally, the old Alone in the Dark had very basic mechanics but was still scary. Story 139. Outlast 2. When I first started playing Ark, Survival Evolved, it was kinda scary for no reason. I still have a hard time going into the ocean. Story 140. Alien Isolation in Virtual Reality. I made it 7 minutes into the game, and I am a grown man who can easily remove any spiders my wife asks me to, but that experience had me trembling. Story 141. To be honest, it was Minecraft. I had been playing it as a kid all the time, and at some point they started adding all the cave sounds and weird environmental sounds. Freaked me out. Story 142. I still have a fear from childhood. It is pianos, if you know. Story 143. You will laugh at me, But it is Detroit Become Human. The button mashing, the pure stress, no. Story 144. Diablo 1. 10 years old me going downstairs in Tristram Church. I fled from my computer. Story 145. Minecraft. The first time I saw an Enderman in my base, it was emotionally scarring as I had never seen one before or heard of them. Story 146. The first 85% of the game was absolutely lame and somewhat eye-roll worthy. But at the end, things got intense quickly and it got under my skin. Story 147. For me, it was some Cthulhu game, if I remember correctly. When I peered into the basement of an abandoned house in a scary town, a non-player character was hanging there. I freaked out, instantly turned it off, and went back to Blockbuster to trade it for something else. Story 148. Horror games? BFF. The first time I ever had to pause a game purely to compose myself was Sekiro, the first time that serpent appeared. I am not afraid of snakes nor giant monsters typically, but something about that whole sequence filled me with a very primal sort of terror. I think it was as much the sound design as the actual creature, and the fact that you never really even see most of its body. 11 out of 10 gaming experience all around. Story 149. I was around 10, maybe 11 when I bought Dead Space because it was on sale. I backed out before I even really started. It was already dark outside. Within the first 5 minutes, you get chased by some nasty alien monsters, and it was too intense for me back then. Good times. Story 150. I turned off Amnesia about 5 minutes in, knowing there were no monsters until a certain point later in the game. I just couldn't handle it. Story 151. Sonic the Hedgehog 1. The boss music when I finally reached Dr. Eggman was the first game to truly scare me. I was also 4 years old at the time. Story 152. Dying Light. The first time it became night in that game, I immediately turned the game off when one of those guys started chasing me. Story 153. Resident Evil 3 for PlayStation, where you encounter the Nemesis for the first time in front of the hall. My heart forced me to leap across the room, screaming, and I turned off my PlayStation 1. Story 154. Gahan Wilson's The Ultimate Haunted House. I was only 6, though. Story 155. I do not play many scary games, nor have I ever turned one off in fear. However, I will admit to pausing the game and leaving my apartment for a brief cooldown walk at the point in BioShock where splicers start pretending to be corpses to ambush you. Story 156. Not gonna lie, I never had a horror game experience that was so bad I had to turn it off. Maybe I have a tolerance when it comes to horror in general. Nevertheless, I did have some games that made me feel really uneasy. Resident Evil 7, for example, had a segment where you run around the house in search of a little kid. The little kid's laughter in the background really unsettled me. At one point, you get to a dead end in the house, which means you have to turn back. As soon as I realized that, the music changed, and when you turn around, you see the kid's legs standing behind the crouchable area that you just passed. Knowing that you have to move towards her was really scary at that moment. Other honorable mentions include Resident Evil Village's baby drama, Outlast, and The Evil Within with the lady who comes out from the floor with long hair. That scream scared me a lot the first time I heard it. Story 157. The Last of Us Part 1 with generator level in basement. It was impressive in 2013 when I was young. Story 158. Pancake Nun, but some virtual reality ones gave me doubt and one I turned off. Alex on release, especially Jeff scenes, made me take a few breathers. The Forest was the same, and the only one I turned off, which I played very early on release, was Phasmophobia. Story 159. Scratches. I got it from a book fair when I was in elementary school. I couldn't even make it past the first couple of hours, if I remember correctly. Something about the atmosphere felt so terrifying at that age. It is probably dated now, though. I do not know and do not care to find out. Story 160. Resident Evil 1. I hate spiders, so battling giant ones, especially if I couldn't run away, was not great. Late in the game, I was in a room with a gray spider, and due to the static camera, a pool table was blocking a large part of the lower view. I lost sight of the spider before it reared up and completely filled the camera view due to its position. I immediately lunged for the PlayStation 1 power button. Story 161. As a child, I used to get anxious and scared playing Luigi's Mansion. I know it is not really scary, but the thought of the first game made me turn it off because I was scared. Not anymore, though. Story 162, Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Every other Five Nights at Freddy's game was fine, only 4 really bothered me. Story 163. I typically did not play horror or scary games, so I never played Silent Hill or Resident Evil until Resident Evil 4. The first game that scared me that much was actually FEAR, and it was not even a typical scary section. It was when the invisible enemies were introduced and would punch you. It scared me so much that I turned the game off and never actually finished it. Story 164. Resident Evil on the PlayStation 2. I received a bunch of games from my older cousin, who may not have realized he was passing his collection to an 8-year-old. Story 165. A relatively unknown title called Nosferatu. It is a first-person sandbox game with multiple paths and multiple possible endings depending on how many relatives you have saved. The atmosphere is great, enemies are relatively harder, and combat is awkward. If you think having a pistol will make the game easier, you are wrong. I mostly stopped playing because of the creepy atmosphere and difficult enemies. My eye-hand coordination is not that great, and the combat is awkward. Story 166. This has never happened to me because I simply do not play games that are scary enough. On the occasion that I encounter a scary level in a non-horror game, I am able to power through it. I will not lie, though, the haunted levels in Super Mario 64, Vampire, The Masquerade Bloodlines, Hogwarts Legacy, and Thiefall had me on edge to varying degrees. Story 167. I played The Last of Us twice before I got pregnant with my daughter. After she was a few weeks old, I started playing again. I reached the part where Joel's daughter, Sarah, is shot by a soldier and dies. I don't think it is a spoiler at this point. I became very nauseous and started crying. I turned it off and have not played it since. Story 168. Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. Couldn't get through the play area by myself. Had no problem watching someone else play but couldn't do it myself. Story 169. Black Ops 1 Zombies post-campaign. I was about 10 years old when it came out. Story 170. Carnivores. The Tyrannosaurus Rex mauling me was more than I could take. Story 171. Detention is about 2 students trapped in a high school in Taiwan during the White Terror period in the 1960s. Story 172. Alien vs. Predator for personal computer in the 1990s. The entire Marine playthrough is heart-racing, and the first time you encounter a xenomorph is unreal. Story 173. Slenderman, 7 pages to collect. I was a kid and just gave up. After that, it was Subnautica. I was very scared there. Story 174. Oddly enough, it was Diablo 2. In the first act, you run into giant spiders in the dark, and I was so unprepared I got hit by arachnophobia and ran all the way back to the camp. I didn't play again for about a week. It is strange because I do not have arachnophobia in real life, but for some reason, they really got me bad. Story 175. I recall literally running away from the television as a child because of the giant spider inside the deca tree. I did not turn it off, but I had to ask my mother to turn it off for me. Story 176. Nothing ever bothered me too much until Visage. Forget that game. Story 177. Visage, actually. I have played horror games before, but I couldn't handle them. I tried it again a year ago and finished it. Story 178. Alien Isolation. I noped out of that game multiple times. Absolutely terrifying. Story 179. I cannot handle horror games for some reason, so it was actually Five Nights at Freddy's. Sister Location. Story 180. Haven't played many, but Eyes the horror game used to make me truly anxious and scared. Story 181. Is this content intended for a YouTube video? The title clearly suggests YouTube. Story 182. The first Silent Hill game and the original Resident Evil. When you first encounter a hunter, the cutscene shows something running through the garden and opening the door. Story 183. A Cry of Fear is an intense experience. Watch a video about it or play it for free on Steam. Story 184. Alien Shooter gave me fear and anxiety when I was a kid before I knew what I was feeling. Story 185, Outlast. Surprised I have not seen that mentioned yet, but that game was truly uncomfortable at times. Story 186, Five Nights at Freddy's. Sister location. I turned the game off before the menu even appeared. I was 14 and not scared by anything else, well, maybe other Five Nights at Freddy's games. I still haven't opened the game again since. Story 187, Fatal Frame 2. The very first house almost made me quit as a kid. Story 188, Quake. When a monster jumped out of some hallway in dead silence in the game and in the house, I almost had a heart attack, but I did not turn it off. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.